We're excited to come to you as a hybrid, both virtual and in person, and we have the opportunity to share some information with you that we feel is relevant to the community. So today we have Carter Stewart, who is the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio, and also the lead investigator for the research evaluation of the City of Columbus response to the 2020 summer protests. He worked with the Glenn College of Public Affairs at Ohio State University to think about how our local police department and other systems that were engaged in that protest could think about best practices for supporting our local community, folks who want to let their voices heard. So welcome, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, very glad to be here.
Awesome. So can you tell us a little bit about your background in law and criminal justice?
Sure. I was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio for about 7 years. I was appointed by President Obama and confirmed by the Senate to lead that office. That office included Columbus, Cincinnati, and Dayton. Before that, I was an assistant U.S. attorney in San Jose, California, and also practiced at a couple different law firms. But I got into it really because of how I was raised. I grew up on the campus of Spelman College in Atlanta and was taught that public service and actually education were the two highest callings you could have. And when I became a lawyer, I really wanted to serve the public. And I saw being part of the public safety system as a way of serving the public, which is what led me to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the first place.
Awesome. And so one way of serving the public is to bring to light information in connection to this report, for example. So why this report, and of course, why now?
Right. Well, I was asked to do it by Zach Klein, the city attorney. And I did see it as a call to public service. I knew it would be a difficult report to put together. I knew that no matter how well we did with the report, people would be upset on all sides. But to me, it seemed to be incredibly important in the world that we live in today to examine what has happened in the past. And I recognize that doing the report is not going to by itself solve anything. But without it, it's going to make it all the harder to change anything. So these types of reports are extremely important, and so I agreed to do it.
So tell us a little about the high-level goals of this report. So I hear change and needing people to have information to have informed change.
Right.
So what are some of those high-level goals you have?
The goals were to, on one level, help city leadership and the police department review how they handled the protests. And the research actually looked not just at the police department, but at the entire city. How did the city do in responding to what happened? And the goal was to try to give them tools and recommendations for how to do better in the future, with the assumption that it's going to happen again, that these are going to continue. And sometimes they might be worse. So trying to protect people to the extent possible, trying to protect property, ensure public safety, all of that I think is helped by looking back at events and thoroughly evaluating to make sure that we can do better. And I also wanted Columbus to be part of the national conversation. These types of reports are happening all over. There are multiple cities who have done it or who are doing it now. And Columbus is in so many ways a microcosm of the country. And I thought it was important for Columbus's own findings and recommendations to be heard on the national level.
Mm-hmm. So thinking about national exposure, the Columbus Police Department has been accredited and known to have high levels of, what's the word I'm looking for? Best practices in policing and et cetera, and they have touted that for a while. How do you square that with the Columbus Police Department's reaction to the protests?
So the police department is CALEA accredited, which is the highest accreditation you can have as a police department. Just because you have a certain level of accreditation doesn't mean that you will be ready for all events. The Columbus Police actually had protocols in place to address public unrest, but the execution was flawed and there were some pieces missing. But in part that was because Columbus and cities across the country had never seen anything like this before. This is something that nobody was prepared for and that nobody was even thinking about. So it's kind of like what happened in the New Jersey, New York area 10 years ago with storms there, people prepared, and then the next storm that just hit a few days ago was worse than anything they had seen before. And so all the preparation, all the planning did not suffice to deal with the situation at hand.
Given that protests aren't new to the United States, why was it that this particular protest in Columbus was so different than what Columbus Police Department was prepared for?
It was different across the country. So cities had not seen the level of demonstration in terms of people coming out. They had not seen the duration, the number of days that people actually stayed out protesting. They also had not seen the anger directed towards the police themselves at such a sustained pace ever. So I think the reason that it happened itself should be studied more, but it was the combination of George Floyd's murder. It was the combination of what has happened over the last few years with growing frustration in communities across the country that kind of exploded in ways that nobody anticipated.
You mentioned community frustration with police as an institution. In your report, you had some police that said they were surprised at the level of anger coming from the community. Why do you think there was some disillusionment there from the local police?
That was actually one of my biggest areas of surprise. I was surprised that the police themselves were not as aware of some of the pockets of anger and frustration in the community. There's some folks obviously who have good relations with the community, with the police, and that's I think where the police focused their connection and their attention. But there were definitely significant areas, particularly among Black folks, who did not share that view, and the police did not actually seem to acknowledge the fact that there was that level of anger and frustration against them in certain areas of the city.
So they also highlighted some distrust, right,
Yes.
between community and police, which seems to have compromised the relationships necessary for the police to be informed about that,
Right.
that frustration. So can you talk a little bit about what you found or what you suggest that the police and the community can do so that communication can happen?
Right. So the time to find voices to talk to and engage with is not in times of crisis. You want to do it in advance of any crisis. And actually there are some efforts in Columbus going on right now through the Divided Communities Project led by Nancy Rogers and Carl Smallwood that is trying to do just that, establish some connections between community and law enforcement, trusted connections, so that when there are problems that arise, people know who to talk to, information can be spread, and confusion can be reduced. That the police did not have the extent of connections they needed in order to do that. So there's a lot of work to do in terms of, some folks call it rebuilding community trust. I would call it building community trust because it has not been there in certain areas for a long time.
And thinking about distrust, there was some talk in your report regarding professional agitators. So believing that most of the people who are practicing their First Amendment right to protest were doing it peacefully. But there was a small pocket of folks who were agitating the police and causing violence. Now there's been some talk around people saying that there's professional agitators as a way to dismiss the actual anger that's present in the community. Do you think that could be the case where there may not actually been professional agitators, but actually community members that were really that angry and demonstrated in that way?
There's no question to me that the folks in the community were mad and demonstrating. There's no question about that. What was interesting to me is that both the police and protesters that we talked to, and I should have mentioned we interviewed 170 police, protesters, downtown residents, as well as some public officials to put together a report. Both the police and the protesters both said they felt that there were outside people there taking things up to a different level that they didn't want them taken to. The police felt that there were agitators who were organizing around the country and encouraging protesters to do things around the country in a concerted, organized way to the detriment of the police. Protesters felt that there were people who came in from the outside who were breaking windows, who were increasing violence, who were throwing the bottles and throwing the bricks at the police, that people who were exercising their First Amendment rights weren't doing. So both sides pointed to another group that was making things worse. The arrest records that we saw did not show anybody from outside of Ohio. The folks who were arrested came from Columbus and the surrounding areas. So we did not see evidence of outside agitators involved in this protest.
So one of the things that you also, your team also brought up was this challenge around different kinds of protests. So you had folks who were protesting against COVID precautions, and we saw the, I don't know what we want to call it, demonstration at the Capitol. So how do you think we should be thinking about police having to protect the protesters who are protesting them, which is a unique situation?
And that contributed to the volatility of this protest. There was a perception from some of the folks we talked to on the protester side that police showing up in riot gear, which looks militaristic, was very different from how they showed up to the COVID or the mask protest at the Capitol that happened a little bit before. So there were some protesters who said they came to us with looking like military, and they stood and didn't do anything or look in any way threatening to the folks who were protesting the mask. So they saw a difference in how the police addressed them. We did not, our research did not show a difference, but that's what some of the people told us. But when the police themselves are the subject of the protests, and you have crowds and crowds of people gathering, and then police gathering themselves to protect public safety and to protect against damage and harm, that is a volatile situation. And that's one of the reasons why this was such a unique situation, because the protest activity that the police have trained for the most part, was not designed with them being the purpose of the protest. So that's why there are new best practices that have to be developed that are different from the way police have been trained before.
Absolutely. And although I had it in mind, I didn't really fully wrap my mind around, like how do I protect the people who are protesting me?
Right,
that's very unique.
Tough position.
Which is which is not the same as, of course, when we think of like the March on Washington for jobs, like Martin Luther King and Selma, like that was voting rights. That was, yes, police violence was involved, but that wasn't the reason for the protest.
Right.
So that is an interesting way for us to be having to think about that. So I want to talk a bit about some things that stood out to you from your findings. What rose to the top?
A couple things. One, we've already talked about the disconnect between police and the feeling of parts of the community. I say parts because there's a significant portion that is frustrated with the community, but there's also a large group that feels like it has good relations with the community. But there seems to be a blind spot for for the communities that did have extreme frustration and anger towards the police. So that was surprising. And I was surprised by the gap between the police and city leadership. There was a lot of anger and frustration on the police behalf against the police, the city leadership, and how they responded during the protests, and a lack of communication too. So that disconnect I was not expecting. So those were the areas that rose to the top in terms of the biggest surprise to me.
Absolutely. So a few takeaways. What do you want the police, and I say the police meaning not just maybe in particular to Columbus, but police in general, what do you want them to be thinking about after reading your report?
I'll speak to the police in Columbus with the hope and expectation that it actually applies to police everywhere, which is a couple things. The public views the police from a historical perspective. So it's not just the men in uniform, men and women in uniform today, it's the folks who were there last year and the year before, and 10 years and 20 years and 40 years ago. And I say that because when we talked to the protesters, there were folks who had brought up police shootings that happened in 2019 and 2018 and 2017 as part of their anger that they directed towards the police. So it wasn't just George Floyd's death. There were also older folks that we talked to who were marching in the 1960s and 1970s against police misconduct, and they viewed the police through a 40-year prison. And then there were folks who remembered having bad experiences feeling harassed in middle school, who talked about how there were specific cops in Columbus who they felt mistreated black middle school students. And so all of this is part of the problem, and the police need to understand that there's a historical aspect to this, and they have to address the historical aspect to it. That's one takeaway. A second takeaway would be that power, it's important for the police to recognize that power has changed in our society. There used to be a time when it was all hierarchical, and it was do as I say and just do it. And that applied to parents, that applied to police officers, that applied to business leaders. And in today's world, it's not so hierarchical. The people have more power. It's more diffuse, it's more flat in terms of how power is wielded. And police need to understand that. And I think they will need to address their systems and their procedures through a new lens of thinking we can no longer just say, do as we say and do it, but come at it in a way that's more explanatory, more communicative, and much more embracing community input as to how they do their jobs.
I want to touch on those 2 points. So first, this idea of me as a police officer, my conduct, my choices operate somehow in this vacuum that is detached from the larger institution of policing and also the historical connection to policing, which feels like it's connected to this idea of focusing on bad apples, right? Individual police officers who are making bad choices is not a reflection of the entire system. Did you get any of that in your interviews that seemed to focus more so on the individuals rather than understanding a larger system?
To a certain degree. One of the frequent things we heard from police officers was what happened in Minneapolis had nothing to do with us. And that was part of the confusion as to why what happened hundreds of miles away would generate such anger and frustration here. So I think that's in line to a certain extent with what you just said. And to me, it ignores the idea of institution, that policing is an institution in this country, even if there are individual police departments. When I was an assistant U.S. attorney, I was told that when we stand up in front of a judge and say, I represent the United States, and that the judge is going to believe the next thing we say, it's not because of us as individuals, it's because of the institution that we represent and the men and women who came before us who built that reputation. I think the same thing applies to police. They're wearing the uniform today, but the institution goes far beyond them, and they have to somehow address and acknowledge that history in trying to move forward with community healing.
And people don't live in isolation, right? So was it, I want to say 2015 in Chicago, where people were given about $5 million in reparations from police torture. So thinking about accountability and how that is not just in one location, people are experiencing similar experiences across the country, which leads me to this idea of rethinking power, because what comes with considerable amount of power oftentimes is a lack of accountability. And although Columbus Police Department, one of their core values, as you all stated in your report, is accountability, there seems to be a disconnect there between that accountability and power, the ways in which the community sees that, which I found really interesting. Are you seeing that connection as well?
Well, not specifically. All of the officers we talked to felt that what happened to George Floyd was absolutely wrong. There's nobody who defended it. There's nobody who in any way condoned it. But there also wasn't a sense of, we recognize what's happened here in Columbus recently. We're sensitive to the community's frustrations, and we're trying to figure out ways to address it. There were a few folks who said that in the police, but not a lot. But I think accountability is clearly what the public is asking for, and what the public wants when it comes to their police department.
What do you want the protesters to understand from your report? What do you want them to pull from this?
It's incredibly important that when dialogue occurs, and I recognize that I believe government has to take the first step in order to try to heal the distrust and the division. And it's a vicious chicken and egg situation, because you can't really have healing without engagement, but you're not going to have engagement without some healing. And so it's a circular problem. But at some point, folks in the community who have been outraged, who have been angered by the police, by city leadership, will have to, in my mind, engage and come to the table and have the tough conversations about reform, about policy changes, about accountability. Without that type of engagement from all sides, it will be hard to move the needle in a really positive direction. And a lot of folks we talked to told us that there are people who didn't talk to us because they didn't trust the system, they didn't think anything was going to change, they didn't want to get involved because of that, and they would not come and engage. At some point, I'm hoping that more people decide that they actually do want to have these conversations once there is a demonstrated commitment in good faith from city leadership, from the police, that the change is possible. So engagement at some point is going to be absolutely necessary.
And you talked about Charlotte having these teams of conversation where the police seem to be a bit doing kind of de-escalation work. Can you talk a little bit about that as a potential beginning for
Sure.
that healing?
Yeah, so one of the biggest frustrations from the protester side was that they wanted the police to explain what was happening and why. So there were, and this goes back to frustrations that the police had too. Especially in the first few days of the protest, one day the officers would be told, don't let anybody in the streets, or arrest them or push them back. And then the next day they would be told, let them in the streets. And so there was confusion on the officers' part from their own leadership. What do we do? And so the protesters had the same confusion. So they said, in talking to us, one day we were allowed to be in the street, and then the next day we were told we couldn't be in the street. And then we wondered why we were allowed to be in some areas but not in other areas. So that type of communication, that dialogue, would have actually de-escalated some of the feeling on the protester side. They also said that they overwhelmingly appreciated officers coming out and just talking to them and walking with them and engaging with them without the riot gear, but just in their soft uniforms. Those types of conversations absolutely helped, based on the folks that we talked to. And the dialogue teams would basically implement that as a policy device, so that just as a matter of course, with any kind of protest, you would have designated officers doing just that to help explain and de-escalate the situation.
So what takeaways would you suggest the Black community to take from the findings that you had in this report?
I hope that folks will read the report and look at the police procedures that are outlined there. It's so important for the public to know how the police department operates. And one of our recommendations is for the police department to publicize more how its policies and procedures that the public can see. But I think it's also incumbent on the public, and Black folks especially, to go and read what are these policies. Because if you want to argue for change, if you want to argue for things to be different, it's important to understand what is right now. And that's in the report, in terms of a lot of the police procedures, a lot of the ways that they're set up to handle protests. So I would hope that folks would read the report, read these procedures, and figure out what do they want changed, and at some point come to the table to make that case.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was great. I know you're busy changing the world, so thank you for taking a few minutes with us.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for joining us for TEDxKingLincolnBronzeville Conversations. We will have the report available to you for you to read, look at those findings, and think about what your actions will be. Want to thank Carter Stewart for joining us, and appreciate you for learning more.